House Oversight Committee says it's officially sent one subpoena, and this one goes to President Biden's former physician, Dr. Kevin O'Connor. He's refused to partake in a voluntary interview, and now Oversight Chairman James Comer is demanding he appear for a formal deposition on June 27th, where O'Connor will face questions on Biden's mental acuity during those depositions, presumably, and Republicans will likely focus on these statements made after Biden's annual checkups. Throughout the previous administration, he called Biden healthy, active, vigorous, and always maintained that he was fit to execute the duties of the presidency, quote, without any exemptions or accommodations. So those were the forward-facing statements, but let's look at some of the statements from the book that Alex Thompson put together. Marie, here's one of them. This is Kevin O'Connor talking about Biden, a potential wheelchair. He said that he recommended potentially a wheelchair. This is according to the book. Most apparent was Biden's halting walk, and it had become so severe there were internal discussions about putting the president in a wheelchair, but they couldn't do so until after the election. Kevin O'Connor privately told folks he may need a wheelchair. Also, Kevin O'Connor had long privately expressed concern about the toll the presidency was taking on Biden's health. O'Connor sometimes quipped that Biden's staff was trying to kill him while he was trying to keep him alive. So O'Connor was very much part of this backward discussion, if you believe the book.
Well, what's interesting is the quotes you just read generally refer to physical health. And we all saw Biden's physical health deteriorating in front of us, right?
And mental.
Well, but that's a separate question. And I have not seen evidence presented by a doctor or someone else that would say that Joe Biden was not mentally able to do the job.
Did you watch the debate?
I did, but that's a different issue, Kaylee. That is not a mental issue. Also, look at, okay, if we want to start putting presidential doctors under subpoena, first of all, there's patient, physician, confidentiality. That is a legal and ethical standard that patients and doctors have protecting them. Do you want to put Donald Trump's doctor under subpoena? Do you want to have Donald Trump's doctor talking about why he makes up numbers about how much he weighs?
I don't think Trump's hiding anything.
I think who doesn't do that? Why we have never heard the full story of exactly what happened when he was really sick with COVID, for example.
Okay, Marie, let me finish, I cannot believe what I'm hearing. He took a cognitive test and passed it.
Kaylee,
Kevin O'Connor wouldn't even give one to Biden.
If you want to start putting doctors of presidents publicly under subpoena, I think a lot of Republicans, starting with Donald J. Trump, will have very bad things coming out about them. This is a dangerous precedent to set.
So you believe Donald Trump is in bad health?
I don't know what Donald Trump's health is like, but when I watch him on TV and he forgets names of people, he mixes things up. He's repeatedly saying things that when Joe Biden said them, Republicans were like, he's mentally impaired. Donald Trump says mentally impaired things every single day, and no one bats an eye.
I think you're the last Democrat on planet Earth dying on this hill of Biden was perfectly mentally capable and Trump is not. And polling, by the way, reflects, like, your own party didn't want him to run.
I don't think he should have run. I agree. I don't think he should have run, but I think he was mentally capable of doing the job when he was president.
Here's something that the White House doctor I worked under with President Trump when he took questions during Trump and COVID. He didn't do this. Let's watch. This is Kevin O'Connor running away from the New York Post, not answering questions, quite the opposite of what Trump's doctor did during COVID. Watch.
How's the president's health?
It's excellent. Thanks.
It is? Are you going to come to the briefing room to address us? Probably not. Could that change before the end of his term? And how is his mental cognition?
It's excellent.
It's excellent. Is there a reason you didn't perform a cognitive test on him?
I don't need to. He's here every day.
He's good every day? And what about the speculation about Parkinson's disease or a related condition? Dr. O'Connor, is there anything to that speculation that there might be something related to Parkinson's that he has?
Yeah, he's good.
Okay. And the specialist's visit to the White House, does that have anything to do with that concern?
No, he's seen him 3 times. Yeah, the mental letter was clear.
Great reporter there at the New York Post. Emily, that was 4 days after Biden dropped out, and he said he was in excellent condition.
Yeah, and a few things there. So first of all, he said visit singular, but the whole point was there were 6 visits within 9 months by the Parkinson's specialist. I hope, by the way, that the first question asked of this physician in this interview is, did you administer a prostate levels check? And if so, why didn't you release the results?
I don't think they did.
And if
I don't think they did.
Then I would ask,
genuinely.
Then I would ask, why didn't you?
Agree. I agree with that.
Yeah. And then respectfully, Marie, I feel like your answer sort of indicates it's like the 2 prongs that the Democrats always rely on, which is, number one, whatever a physician says has to be, you know, it's incontrovertible. And the whole point is, if a physician well, he says this, but I believe my own eyes. I believe the massive mental decline that happened before my eyes, just as I believe in my personal interaction with President Trump, where he was literally more with it than I am. I mean, he remembers more than I do. And I have such faith in his mental acuity. And I feel like the hanging your hat on sort of a record of this physician, that's why we're pulling him in with a subpoena. It's to say, how could you have put this on these records? And then secondly, the whataboutism, where the pivot to President Trump, when the whole point is we're talking about Biden's mental acuity here. And those rendering the subpoenas have said, we hope in these interviews it's not a public forum, so there'll be less drama, hopefully, an uninterrupted 45-minute span, because I think personally that physician has the most to answer out of anyone in that cabinet.
It just sets a precedent. It sets a precedent that then we all have to say every White House doctor has to go before Congress.
One of the precedents I'd love to set is every president should get a cognitive test. Biden was the exception. Trump did one. Cheryl, the physician's just one part of this. There's only been one subpoena that's gone out. There's also going to be potentially subpoenas to Biden's aides, but I think it's much bigger than that. I want to hear from generals in the Situation Room. Yeah. I want to hear about national security decisions. That has nothing to do with the auto pen, but those are honestly the situations I care about most, where we lost troops overseas, and I want to know about the mental capacity there.
There are national security implications if you indeed do have a president, the commander-in-chief, that is impaired, whether that is physical health, whether it is a cancer diagnosis that was hidden or not detected by said doctor, who knows, or by the fact that we did see with our own eyes, and I'm glad you pointed that out, and now the Democrats are admitting that, thank you, Jake Tapper, that we saw a mentally impaired. We saw a mentally, physically impaired president that was sleeping a lot, as we have now learned at his time in Camp David when he was prepping for the debate, after going to Italy, after going to the G7. I thought, I'm sure y'all talked about Bill Clinton on The View and how he was saying, well, you know, his staff, that was their fault. I mean, in a way, yeah, those are the subpoenas, and that's the testimony I want to see. And I'm not a big fan of congressional hearings because it wastes taxpayer money, and I don't like to see that. But at the same time, I think we do need answers because of the national security implications of having a impaired commander-in-chief, whatever that impairment is, guys.
Yep, Tom.
Yeah, I think that, I agree, Cheryl. I don't want to see subpoenas. I don't want to see hearings. I don't need to see reports from the doctor, EKGs, everything. We saw it with our own eyes. So the question was, could Biden do the job? It appeared he could not do the job. He couldn't hold a press conference without meandering and telling stories about his uncle, the cannibal, or whatever. You know, we were seeing it with our own eyes. So I don't need to see a medical report. I don't need to have a hearing. So I'd say forget the subpoenas. A doctor can look at an EKG and say one thing, and another doctor will say something else. So I don't need to hear from the experts on this. As a voter, I'm enough of an expert to say, that guy shouldn't have been in office. And that's the discussion we should be having. Voters should be able to make these decisions, but the media was covering it up. The media was covering it up and saying, you're not seeing what you're seeing. They were denying what we were seeing with our own eyes.
And the party's paying for it.
And this is where the Republican Party needs to be crystal clear, because this is not about delving into one man's health and his personal records. It is about the nexus between what we all saw and the policy outcomes, the open border, where'd the immigration plan go, the decisions made in the Situation Room. Those are the unknown questions. How did the mental acuity affect your life? And that very much matters to you.
Hey, everyone. I'm Emily Campagno. Catch me and my co-hosts Harris Faulkner and Kaylee McEnany on Outnumbered every weekday at 12 p.m. Eastern, or set your DVR. Also, don't forget to subscribe to the Fox News YouTube page for daily highlights.